unfortunately, oh, cool. Unfortunately, Dr. Sweet's wife caught tuberculosis because at the night that they were faced with a mob outside of their house, everybody in the house got arrested, and his wife caught tuberculosis in prison, passed it to their daughter, and both of them ended up passing away. Yeah, and then eventually, following the trials and that, Dr. Sweet lost his practice. He lost the house, and he eventually committed suicide because that was a lot of tragedy in that. And so that one moment of success ended up leading a lot of pain. Thank you for sharing. Over here, let's see. I'm going to show these pieces, and then we're going to kind of be interrupted for a second. And then I got these pieces. So the pieces along this back wall, they talk about our diverse communities. I do walking tours of this exhibit sometimes, and one of the first things that I like to do, and that is to actually start off with acknowledging that we are on stolen land. And that when we think about how this country was founded and how it was started, and that it was started with a series of genocide, and there was people here before us. In Michigan, in particular, where we are on the land of the Anishinaabe, or the Three Fire Tribe, and that's made up of the Ojibwa, the Potawatomi, and the Odawa. These communities still exist, and they exist in a few different formats because there's an ongoing struggle for land recognition, for recognition of our treaties, and that the United States has made with different tribes and with different groups. And so I take this moment to kind of recognize that. We here in the state of Michigan actually have one of the bigger reservations actually located in our Upper Peninsula called Keweenaw Bay. Missouri actually has the biggest Anishinaabe reservation in the country. Unfortunately, because of mass, not only just the genocide, but the mass removal that has happened throughout the years with our indigenous communities, a majority of our Anishinaabe are actually located in a totally different state. A lot of our tribes have been relocated, and they're not on their original native lands. The Anishinaabe are actually were considered almost like a nomad, I think is the best word, where they would kind of travel throughout the different lands. So the Anishinaabe land is actually part of Canada, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And it kind of loops down a little bit too into what we now call Indiana and Ohio. So it's important to recognize that history and to recognize that process of colonization. There is a struggle about trying to contain and retain some of this culture and language. Unfortunately, we've seen some tribes who have lost languages, and so it's pretty awesome when we get to hang out with folks from the different Anishinaabe communities and who are still embracing and teaching their young folks their language. And a couple of the other communities, because Metro Detroit is one of the most diverse regions in this country, we are also one of the most segregated. We bounce between the top 5 every time the census comes out. So we talk about the Latin community, we talk about the Jewish, Arab and Asian American communities as well. And these talk about like the local history and the local migration and how, where we see some of the communities now and how they've come to be. And like when we think about our Latin American communities and like where we talk about Southwest, that's not where it originally started. It got broke up through the creation of a freeway. And ironically, we're breaking up that community again with the creation of a bridge. But this talks about some of that history and we talk about the story of Vincent Chen, who was a Chinese American and was mistaken as Japanese American and was attacked by a couple of white factory workers. And his, yeah. Yes. Yep. 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 And so his death actually is considered to be one of the biggest sparks to Asian American civil like action and activity in that. Like we've seen a lot of civil rights movements really emerging after that. What's really cool to kind of do research on that, we only lightly touch on it in this exhibit piece, but is looking at how national policy, like we actually as a country had a ban in place for letting in Asian American, like folks from different Asian countries. And so when we take that into consideration, and when we think about too, like with World War II, we here in this country had internment camps, and where we were moving as a government, removing our Japanese American folks, and that for fear of like invasion. And so this kind of talks about some of that history. And unfortunately, Vincent Chen was one of the individuals that was caught up in that. Along the wall over here, we talk about our historical communities. So like we talk about the Old West Side, we talk about Kona Gardens, Sojourner Truth Housing Complex, 8 Mile Wyoming community, and Black Bottom. And we talk about these communities because one of the interesting components is that with forced segregation, what we saw was thriving communities evolve out of that. If you have nowhere to go and you don't have a way to interact with others, and that gives the opportunity to actually then turn those resources into yourself. And we have thriving businesses, that we had thriving homes, and that. The challenge though, and in particular as this kind of comes out of with 8 Mile Wyoming and with Black Bottom, is that you didn't have support by government. And so while these communities were thriving, we were also seeing struggle, like where properties were kind of declining because they were not getting support from their city, like as other white communities were, to develop, to invest. And so we lift up these communities because they have really helped to lay like some of the groundwork and the foundation in our metro area. Kona Gardens is an amazing place that actually the original homeowners of that place have actually created what a historical society called the Kona Gardeners. And they actually provided us with the stories and some of the pictures that we have contained in this piece. And that something to just draw out like a connection between Sojourner Truth and over here along this one wall is we talk about the 1943 race riots. Prior to 1943, we had seen a lot of rising tension in factories, just in the broader communities, and that particularly around race and around like living. And so in 1942, when Sojourner Truth was being like launched, there was resistance by factory workers to have a community and housing complex that was designated for African Americans. There was a lot of back and forth with FHA, with the government around being able to designate this housing for Black factory workers. And so it took a second attempt to actually have families who had already paid for rent to move into their housing. And the tensions that we had seen rising around that period, and that really culminated in 1943. And with what we saw as a race riot. I have that paired in particular with 1967 Uprising, because 1967 is a rebellion, and that is different. Like we hear it often in suburban spaces, even in parts of Detroit, and that where we'll hear it's like, oh, it's the 1967 riots and that, but academics, historians recognize it as a rebellion. These were a group of people that the folks in that city at that point were done not being heard. At the point that 67 happened, there had been an increase in an influx of police shootings. You had the Four Horsemen, who were a notorious police unit. There was 4 officers that would ride around the city harassing community members. You had, Yep, the Big Four. And that they had a couple different names. And you saw in the city of Detroit in particular, the unemployment rate was nearly double what it was in the rest of the metropolitan area and even in the country. You also had lack of access to housing. Preceding 67, we had seen a mass removal of Black Bottom and that. So we had a bunch of community members that were being forced out of their community because it was set up for slum clearance. And so that pushed residents out of their community, out of their neighborhood. They'd lost these roots in this historical community where they'd been thriving and being able to work with you, build and work and have community with each other. And they lost that when the city basically wiped out their community for a freeway. But what we had seen happening in the city of Detroit too was with the rise of those freeways and the rise of a couple of bills, like the GI Bill, as well as the shift in how we did mortgages, and that the mortgages that we see today, where you only have to put down, I think it's 10%, 10, 15%, which is way less than what it used to be. And the fact that you have the government willing to back mortgages, and that saw a rise in suburban communities. So we saw the rise of the metropolitan area, and it was like a mass exodus of white people in particular. And they weren't the only ones, but it was the vast majority of folks leaving the city of Detroit and coming out into the suburbs, because now all of a sudden you could work and not have to live in the same community. And that because now you had an easier way to travel between where you lived and where you worked. And so, so what we had seen by the time 67 happened is you had a lot of folks that had lost their roots. We had seen this mass shift happening in the city of Detroit because of the shifting demographics that had been leading up prior to that. And so 67 was really that point of organizers and of community folks saying enough is enough and you're not hearing me in that. And so I put those two pieces together often to help compare between a riot and a rebellion in that. And then we lead kind of through this middle, and that I've got a series of these tripods, and these are actually the significant court cases. One of the things, so as Father Chris mentioned, I have a law degree. I still have to take the bar, so I'm not quite there yet as an attorney, but one of the things that was really awesome is that I had started learning about this exhibit before I went to law school. And so when I actually got into law school and I started reading these cases, and I started reading the policies that were related to this stuff, it was like, I get it. And that actually helped me pass class a couple times. But these pieces, they talk about, in particular, these two pieces here in the middle, they talk about how the Federal Housing Administration was created. And they talk about what it was based on. Whoops, I'm gonna step right between y'all. Just so that way folks kind of get a glimpse. They're not super sexy in that, because a lot of them, with them being about policies and stuff, they just don't have as many engaging photos and that, but they're significant because these help to shape how society, how our society and how our communities were interacting with each other in that. But one of the things that I think that I like to pull out is the fact that when we think about how policy is shaped, it's a very cyclical relationship. When FHA was founded, it was actually founded on the underwriter manuals on real estate practices and policies, like redlining, that got indoctrinated. So these were practices that that local government had started, and that got blessed by the federal government in many ways. And so then that helped to continue to spread. Yeah.
In the
yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Shot.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Take that picture. Yeah. Yeah, that's amazing. So one of the things that since And we actually have one of the cases that's called Shelley V Kramer. That was actually a joint case. Shelley V Kramer happened in Missouri, and then McGee versus Sipes happened here in the state of Michigan. And that was the case that helped to lead to the disuse of restrictive covenants. And so after that case was decided upon, what we saw was a shift of like mortgage companies, deed, like titles, and the folks that handle deeds and that starting to try and delete those out. And that as they started to put it. But if you have folks like handling their original deeds, then you will find language like that. What's interesting about restrictive covenants is they're geographical. Restrictive covenants have been used throughout this country. They have been a great foundational piece for helping to create segregation, to create these sundown towns. But what's interesting about them, when I say that they're geographical, is that it was influenced by who they were excluding. And so like here in Detroit, here in Michigan, we often saw language around no Blacks, no Jewish people, and that. But if you went out west, you would see a lot more language around no Asian people, no Latin American, and often, just like what you said, it wasn't like proper language. It was often the slurs that were included in there. But one thing that was consistent across the country was the fact that all restrictive covenants mentioned no Black people, and that was consistent. So that's amazing. And it's interesting, like if you have any older deeds, go home and see if you can find that. See if it's in your deed. A lot of the newer ones don't have them now. They try to just delete that clause right out. But if you still have an older deed, you may find it. Or if you have a family member who's maybe been in their house like 30, 40 years and that, they may still find that language in their deeds. So that's what these pieces talk about. These two pieces I had mentioned before actually focus in on our education. One is about the Brown versus Board of Education, but the other one talks about the Milligan, Bradley case. I often mix them up with like Garrett versus the city of Hamtramck because they both happened around the same time, and then I accidentally renamed them. But those pieces talk about, with Milligan v. Bradley, that was actually more recent, kind of within our like knowledgeable history right now. And so as you guys review that and read about it, see if if you feel the connection. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So what's interesting with that Milligan case and that is because of like with what you were mentioning in that, like what ended up happening is that the appeals court made that policy that you could only mix up the students in your district. But what was originally being attempted was that they wanted to mix up the students in the region, like within surrounding communities. So they were going to touch on multiple cities, and that they wanted to get into the suburban communities and be able to switch students who were in the city of Detroit and the students who were predominantly in suburbs and be able to mix them using busing. They attempted to base it on the Pontiac busing case that was overseen by Judge Damon Keith. And there's actually a really great book called The Arc of Justice. No, hold on. The Crusader for Justice. There we go. Their names are similar because you have the Arc of Justice about Ossian Sweet, and then you have the Crusader of Justice about Judge Damon Keith. And he oversaw a number of cases that actually followed 1967. That kind of preceded it. And one of the cases that he oversaw was the Pontiac versus busing case, or the Pontiac busing case, where this Pontiac school district actually had it written in one of their policies and that, but they were choosing to like not see it, where they were allowing segregation to happen in their district. Like, so they had their Black students attending one school, white students attending another school. There was a difference in how they were allocated the resources. And so parents were successful in demanding and getting so that their district mixed. And it was done through their busing and that. So like they bused kids to different schools that, regardless of what school was in their, like in the neighborhood at that time. And so Milliken v. Bradley attempted to do that. The problem is that one, they didn't have that policy, and you had folks like L. Brooks Patterson who were very, very intentional and put a lot of effort into keeping our school systems from crossing city lines. And that our district is, or like our state is what we call very balkanized. We are very rigid on our boundaries, on like where our resources go. Like they don't generally cross our city boundaries, our city perimeters. And that's not necessarily normal. Like if you get into other states and that, like where you see regions will grow, they'll shrink, they'll share, but Michigan's very rigid in regards to our boundaries. Yep, that is that is definitely a vestige of our past. Yeah, because we had individuals like Henry Ford who were intentionally influencing policy so that because Henry Ford was a big segregationist. We talk about like the great works that he did in regards to advancing like with the assembly line, with the $5 a day, which was unheard of at that time. But what we were also seeing was his intentional influencing around keeping communities separated and segregated. That's why we saw like the creation of the city of Inkster. We see his influence in like the city of Hamtramck, Highland Park, and that because he didn't want his workers actually work like mixing together. Yep. Oh, interesting. I did not know that. Okay. Oh, wow. Interesting. Yeah, okay. Oh, okay, cool. That's awesome. Well, we're gonna have to chat. Yeah. Yeah, and so that, and that leads into some really good conversation as we start to learn and as we unpack our history and we unpack our stories, and that like we weren't, as individuals, we weren't part of the creation of these policies and stuff and that, but we do have a role in how we can help educate our peers, educate our generations going forward, and helping to undo this. And that's our legacy. And that we didn't start this, but we can help clean it up. Mm-hmm. Yep. 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 Yeah. So the last couple pieces that that we have here is one that's about, it's called Leaders in the Movement. So this talks about some of the role that congregations and churches have had in civil rights, and that churches have been a great space for community to be able to come to meet. It became a safe space. It became a point where information has been spread out. And so this piece in particular kind of just lists up some of the leaders that were like during the 1960s in particular. And then the last piece that I have kind of over here, it talks about the master plan. It talks about a couple of interesting pieces. So we had the first housing project in the country was actually the Brewster Complex. And that was in the city of Detroit. It has been completely demolished now as of, I think, 2015. But the housing projects itself was kind of based on a segregated practice. It was also based on restricting resources, and that there was this, like the federal government knew that they had to provide housing to their Black communities, But they wanted to be conscious about how they did it because they had all of these restrictive covenants in place. They had all of these like sundown town policies in place. And so one of the challenges was how to do that. And so this led to the creation of the housing project, and that these massive like apartment complexes and that. And the challenge though, that what was interesting during this period was that you had architects and sociologists saying, these are a bad idea. And that because you were literally containing and putting people and restricting them into a very, very confined space. And all you're doing is making a recipe for disaster. And so there's actually a local archaeologist, or no, architect, not archaeologist, architect, who talks about how the housing, how the housing projects were actually the grandfather for what we know as hip hop today, and that the rising of the hip hop generation, a lot of our performers and that were used hip hop as a way to speak out against the living conditions and the experiences that they were having. And so as an architect, he took that lens of like, well, the housing complex and this whole creation process is actually the grandfather of our hip hop genre. And that, so it's really cool. And that's a local, I'll have to get his name because he's a local architect actually. But one of the other pieces things that really pop out with this is the use of language. And we still hear it. We hear about like urban renewal, redevelopment, and that green spacing. Those should be red flags. And that, because the question is like, where are they doing it? Who is it being done on? And are they at the table? Because if they're not at the table, that means they're up for serving. And so this talks about a little bit about how master plans, how redevelopment plans have been used to intentionally remove and shift communities. And so that's what this piece is about. And then, yeah. Yep. 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 Yes, it was. Yes. And it was for exactly some of the same things, that the concerns that had been raised up. Yep. Yep. And we don't see now the housing set up that way. And we've seen like a lot of these original projects not being demolished, taken down. There was attempts to actually try and reuse them. They tried to change who the focus was. So like with Brewster, it was originally focused on middle income families, but they could not fill the housing up. And so they started opening it and they started shifting who they let in, and it still wasn't successful. And that was a process that they were attempting across the country. Yep. Yeah. 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 And it's actually like right along like 75 and 375. You can see it right off of the freeway. Yep. Yep. Yeah. So, yeah. Yep. Yep. And so then the last piece, so like I know I've mentioned sundown towns a couple different times. The other piece over here is actually talking about, it's titled A Jewish History in a Sundown Town. And it's actually about the gross point system. As communities, as we were kind of seeing some shift in policies and practices, like at one point, there was something called Rule 9 that was being used by realtors to help to shift and to steer folks into certain communities and that. But as we saw some of these rules being changed or being dropped in that because we were seeing court cases challenging them, we saw different attempts at how to exclude emerging. And then so this piece talks about the gross point system, which was a scale of 0 to 100 that was used to determine who was welcomed into that community. And it was based on like your language, like if you had how heavy of an accent, if you wore cultural garb, if you like where your practices were and that, like they wanted to know because they were still like they wanted to be an all-white community. And so they were going to let some folks in, but they wanted to be careful about how and who they let in. And so that point system was used as a way to do that. And so that talks about that history. And so that's kind of the exhibit in a nutshell. I'll be more than happy to answer questions and to dig into some of this stuff. So I'll be here until Father Chris kicks me out. Yep.